Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Maulana Muhammadin wa alihi wa azwajihi wa zurriyatihi ajmain. Going to look at Kant's moral philosophy, some aspects of Kant's moral philosophy. And Kant's conception of morality is one of the most important conceptions in understanding modern Western civilization. I will be spending a lot of time in coming months and years on this, but this is just one attempt to try to understand this conception. Okay, so the Kantian conception of morality as autonomy. So Kant thinks that morality, to be moral, is to be autonomous. We'll come to what it means. And according to this author, Schneewind, and I agree with him, Kant actually invented this conception out of the blue. This conception didn't exist in its full form before Kant. So there are a few different concepts we need to differentiate between at this point. I think I missed some of the recording, so I'll just go through over it again. So there are a few concepts: the concept of morality, and then there's a concept of autonomy, and then there is a related concept of self-governance. Now, self-governance and autonomy are very similar concepts, but they are different concepts. So self-governance in itself, or by itself, or on its, or in itself, is not autonomy. Autonomy is more than self-governance, although it does involve self-governance. And another conception is that of freedom, and a specific conception of freedom as contra-causal concept. So what Kant's invention was to say that to be moral is to be autonomous. Morality is autonomy. That was Kant's invention. Nobody before him said that. To be moral is to be autonomous. And the opposite of autonomy is heteronomy. So if you are heteronomous, you are immoral in a certain sense. Okay. But we haven't explained any of these concepts yet, but these are the key concepts. And we'll go through them one by one. One, the concept of morality. The second is the concept of autonomy. And the third is the concept of freedom as a contra-causal concept. And the fourth is the concept of self-governance, self-determination, or self-legislation. A concept which is very closely related to autonomous. That's why it can be sort of confused with autonomy. But even though autonomy does involve self-governance and self-legislation and self-determination, autonomy is more than self-governance. And Kant's invention was to say that so Kant connected morality with autonomy. And to be moral is to be autonomous. That's that's Kant's claim, or his invention. Okay, so the Kantian conception of morality as autonomy was not invented out of the blue. Just out of the blue. Kant was raised on the Wolffian view that knowledge can make at least some of us self-governing. And in the writing of Rousseau, as well as the British moralist, he had in the writings of Rousseau as well as the British moralist, he had seen richer and more egalitarian conception of self-governance. And before that, we should say, there are two authors who are important in this respect. One is Machiavelli, and the other is Luther. Probably Machiavelli was the first modern author to develop the conception of autonomy, at least in the political context. Political autonomy. And we find in his discourses the twin conception of positive and negative freedom, which were later popularized by Berlin. So positive and negative freedom. Because in Machiavelli we have the concept of, there are two concepts, the concept of freedom from dependence, so when a city-state or a country is free from the external influence, then it is free or autonomous in the positive, in the negative sense. External dependence or external interference. So that's the freedom from or external intervention. So that's the negative freedom or freedom from. And this negative freedom makes possible positive freedom, that is the actual exercise of freedom, or autonomy in the sense of self-legislation or self-determination, which is freedom too. So once you are free from external influences, external interference, external dependence, then the city can legislate for itself. So that's self-legislation or self-determination or positive freedom, or autonomy in the positive sense. So in Machiavelli we find this twin concept of autonomy as freedom from dependence, and then autonomy as freedom to self-legislate. And these are political concepts because the self here was, or the freedom, the bearer of freedom is a city or state, or the princess, the head of the state, etc. So he's not talking about individual freedom or individual autonomy. So that's Machiavelli in the 16th century. And in the 16th century, Luther also developed this conception of Christian freedoms. And Luther is very, very important for Kant, as well as the context of Descartes in the context of modernity, the emergence of modernity. And I don't think we pay enough attention to Luther in the context of modern philosophy. I think some people have started paying a bit more attention to him. But I think, as Marx noted somewhere, Luther's conception was important in the development of the modern conception of autonomy. And it is very important to understand Luther's conception in order to understand Kant's invention of morality as autonomy. Now, Luther, in his very influential work, Freedom of Christians, Freedom of a Christian, develops his conception of autonomy. And freedom is obviously a very important concept because we understand the conception of autonomy, as we saw in Machiavelli as well, in terms of positive and negative freedom. So Luther talks about, now Luther was working in the context of his fight against the hegemony of the Roman Church or the Catholic Church. So when he's talking about Christian freedom, he's talking about freedom from Roman Church as well. And he's talking about so it's foremost freedom from the institution of church and freedom from the Pope and his whole institution of papacy as the mediatory between self and God. So Luther's conception of freedom as freedom from or negative freedom. So this negative freedom is freedom from, foremost, it is a freedom from Roman Catholic Church, and its mediation between God and the Christian self. But then it is also freedom from flesh or freedom from desires. And dependence on desires. So and I guess freedom from social ties in a sense as well. Freedom from body. And this conception of freedom comes, I think there is a whole tradition in Christianity from St. Paul to Augustine, where this freedom, this conception of freedom as absence of dependence is prominent. In Paul, that was freedom from the law of Torah and the law of Moses as well. So, and in Luther you will find all those elements. And Augustine obviously is the freedom from the desires as well. And both Augustine and Luther are very very close disciples of Saint Paul. I mean, saint. I'm calling him saint just because that's how he is referred to. Not that I believe he was a saint. So this is freedom from dependence or autonomy as freedom from dependence. But then there's a positive conception of freedom in Luther as well. And that is freedom to obey God's laws. This God's law is not the law of church, Roman. Not the law of Moses, because it is curse, according to Paul. So this God's law is some sort of a minimalist spiritual law. And like Kant's categorical imperative, it is empty as well, because if you read Luther closely, you will see that in Luther, this freedom to obey God's law is basically freedom to love God. And this loving God is of a self, a Christian self, which is an atomized self, because this self is detached from the social surroundings, from the even bodily surroundings and the surrounding of the institutions, especially the institution of the Catholic Church. So this self is a very minimalist and bare self. And its relationship with God is unmediated even by body. And God is there, another self or a spirit. And this pure relation of self to self is where this freedom is manifested. And Luther is very careful to point out that there's no external manifestation of this love of God or this obedience to the law of God. That's why he called it freedom. Otherwise, how can you call a law of freedom? Obedience to law of freedom. Precisely because this law is empty, it can make possible a Christian freedom. Anyway, and Kant basically account of autonomy is the development of the Luther's. Kant's account of autonomy is in a sense a transformation and critique of Luther's account. And the thing which we will critique is even this empty reference to the obedience to God's law. Kant develop a critique of this, because for Kant, obedience is heteronomy. So even if you are obeying God, you are heteronymous. Morality can't be obedience to God's law, because morality is autonomy. And if morality is autonomy, it can't be obedience. So one of critiques of Kant, Luther's critique of Kant, is the critique of the conception of morality as obedience. For Kant, morality cannot be obedience. Because not even obedience to God's will. Because for him, as for Luther, morality is freedom, autonomy. And obedience to God's will is heteronomy. So that would be the beginning of Kant's transformation or transposition of Luther's conception of religious autonomy, religious conception of autonomy, into a moral conception of autonomy, where basically it will involve rejection of morality as obedience of God's will or God's law, and God's will, and assertion of morality as personal autonomy, self-legislation, where human gives law to themselves in a sense in which we already see glimpse in Luther, where self obey itself and nothing else. So there is obedience, but that's self-determination or self-governance. That's why it is autonomy. And in that sense, Kant's moral philosophy is closely related to the conception of to Luther, to Protestantism, to Saint Augustine, and to Paul. The conception of Paul as the law, a conception of Paul whereby he claims that the law of God is a curse, and that Jesus, Machiavelli Luther, came to overthrow that curse. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll continue with this, and hopefully it will develop into something useful, whereby we can learn about these different conceptions.